Some days my job can be pretty boring. Someone will send you another end-addressed USB podcasting mic to evaluate. And some days you get to look at the best closed-back headphones that I've ever tried. In fact, we're getting very close to the best headphones I've ever tried. This, for the studio, is absolutely unbelievable. I'm telling you that now, so you'll keep watching and find out more about the Dan Clark E3. The E3 is a planar magnetic headphone. It's the same type as most Audeze and Hi-Fi Man models, but this is a closed-back design with the finest frequency response I've ever heard, and it's purely in the analog domain. Because Dan Clark has invented a thing called AMTS, and you can see on the screen, these resonators actually fit inside the cup here, and by altering the dimensions of them, he can tune the frequency response of the driver in the pure analog domain. There's no DSP, there's nothing else. This is just purely analog. So you plug your headphones into whatever output that you've got and they are going to sound right. And I say going to sound right, we're going to get more into target curves in a minute, but this is just beautiful. And not just in a frequency response way, but also in soundstage. I'd say for studio, for mix work, for mastering, this is pretty much perfect because it's not so wide and vast like Sennheiser HD800S or the Headphones 1 that I've got behind me here, where you kind of get lost and enveloped in the stereo field. This feels like amazing near fields just in front of you, just where near field should be. Think the best near field you've ever heard in a perfect room. Yeah, that's ease. The frequency response is bang on. The transient response is absolutely crisp and excellent, and the distortion is super low. It's just ticking every single box. The presentation is like speakers. That's the other box ticks. It's very unlikely that we see this many box ticks in one headphone. There is one slight limitation to it. I'm going to come to that in a bit. But first, let's look physically at the headphone because, again, it's box ticking. You want something fairly lightweight? Well, this is really comfy. It's got a suspension band at the top and it's kind of got this auto adjustment type thing. But you center that, it stays where it is. I can move my head quite violently and it's not moving about. The cable is beautiful, really low microphonics. I'm rubbing this on my top and I cannot hear that at all in the headphones. This is a really good premium cable and that's exactly what you want in the studio. And they're massive cups. I mean, it's very large area around your ears. It's not sort of having to touch, and I've got massive head and massive ears. And it's just super comfortable. The seal's really good, whether or not I've got glasses on or I haven't got glasses on. The bass is exactly the same. I can't really notice the difference with it. Now let's talk about weight. It's 455 grams, which is sort of fairly chunky for a headphone, but nowhere near even the Audeze MM500. That's 495. The LCD X that sat up there, that's 610. Or, in fact, one of my favourite closebacks up until now has been the Audeze XC. That's 677 grams. The headphones, actually, again, topping the bill, that's over 700 on them, but the headband design on that really does help matters. Whereas with this, you do get a slightly padded, sort of embroidered headband. And that's really comfortable. I've got no problem with this, wearing it for sort of decently long periods at all. It's just really excellent. And there's one other thing. None of the other headphones are that portable. Yes, you get a case with some of them, but they're not really designed for portability. These are. It folds up into that. You get the case in the box with them. They'll just fold up into that and you can pop that in your bag and travel. Now, let's talk tonality. And what I'm going to show you here is the target curve. And this is the frequency response that we want to aim for. Now, up until this year, I've been working towards the curve that you can see here. And this is it was developed by a reviewer called Critical, and it essentially uses the top half of what's called the Harman target, and then has a flat line below 1K down to 20 hertz. And actually, for a mastering mixing situation, this is particularly good because you do want that even curve. Now, the Harman target, developed by Dr. Sean Olive at Harman, which is the parent company of AKG and JBL, was a preferred listening curve. And it's what most people preferred to listen to. And what I'm going to do is just add this in over the top. And you can see there in orange, that is the 2018 version of the Harman target. Why isn't it flat? Well, that is the question I get asked all the time, and it's because this is compensating for the anatomy of your ear and your head. Everyone will hear slightly differently because of the size of their head, the depth of their ear canals, the geometry. Everyone does hear very slightly different. But what we've got here is the middle ground. This is the average adult human, and this shouldn't be too far away for anyone in particular. You should be pretty close to this. So hitting this is essentially hitting most people. If we look here, the reason this isn't flat is that 1K to 20K region is compensating for ear gain. After all of the things I've looked at, this is about right. Something EQ'd to that point, something that's around this target in the ear gain region, I think is pretty much a really good representation of what a set of studio monitor speakers sounds like in a properly treated room. It's very close. So I'm going to take that. As you can see when we go below it, the two lines do differ. And the listening curve, the Harman curve, dips down, sort of centered around 225 hertz, and then goes up as you get into the sub octaves, and that's a boost of about 4 to 5 dB. Now, the dip here, I don't think is particularly suitable for the studio. I don't think that helps you. It's not something that it just doesn't seem correct to me. From listening to monitors in a properly treated, equal, leveled room, it doesn't seem like we should need that. That's a preference of people listening and not what I think we need to mix records. So having something essentially that has the characteristics of the Harman curve to 1K, and then from 1K down almost to 100 is fairly even. And then this little boost. Now, this is quite controversial. Either you like a flat response on the bottom, and a lot of the planars, like the Odysseys, the Hi-Fi Man, all have this response, because essentially it's what you put in is what you get out with a planar driver. It's very hard to get a bass boost in a planar headphone, but the E3 does exactly that. So if we put those two curves together, but with this cheeky raise in the subs, and why would you want a raise in the subs? Well, essentially, when you're listening in the studio, it's not just your ears that you're listening through. You're getting sound through your body, and that's missing when you're listening to headphones. So having that sub-octave prominent, and I often give two EQ options. When we're reviewing headphones and I give you an EQ curve to compensate for it, I'll often give you like a writing one and a mixing one. And the writing one always has raised subs, very much like this. So now let's look at this, and the line in pink essentially is a hybrid of those two curves. So you've got the above 1K region from the Harman curve, flat down to about 125 Hertz, and then it starts going up into boosting those sub-octaves. Now let's see what happens when we put the E3 over the top. That is essentially exactly what it does. The one region there that you will notice there is a discrepancy is 9 to 10K. And what you need to do is ignore that, because it's well known that the grass rig that I've got here with this artificial pinner that's on it does that at 9 to 10K. And essentially, if we found something that didn't do it, that's a bigger red flag than something that does. So take that point there. It's a reaction of the measurement rig with the pinner. Don't worry yourself about it. Just take either side of it around 9 to 10K and kind of draw a line between them, almost where that pink line is going. So that essentially will be your response. So just don't follow that. Don't think you've got to EQ it. Never do that off something that's been measured on one of the grass rigs, because it should show that dip. Now, this is more extraordinary and a little bit easier to read, I suppose, if we actually map this as a difference between the target curve and the E3. It's within a dB all the way down till that 9K dip. And again, ignore that. And you can see here, yes, you have got a very slight boost in the treble, and yes, you can hear that. I mean, if there's one slight downfall of this headphone, is that there is possibly a touch too much airy treble, sort of 11 to 13K. It's just a little touch loud, but it's where your detail is. A little bit of climatization on this, and it's beautiful. I've tried dipping this down, and I prefer it without doing the dip. I prefer to just leave it alone and let it get on with it. It's that not intrusive. But it's no good me just telling you about this, because especially if you're from the studio world, you probably haven't dug massively deep into the different headphones and how they perform. So let's have another look at a comparison. Let's pull out something that's sat up there. That's the Audeze LCD-X. And you can see with the LCD-X in that lovely mustardy type colour that you've really got quite a difference here. Now, if we think of that original neutral target line that was flat from 1K down to 20, it does quite well. I mean, that's sort of really even from 800 Hertz down to about 30, 36, 37. Really good. Little bump at 800 Hertz, and then fairly close adherence up until you get to the 3 to 5K region. And unfortunately, that is where the LCD-X falls down. Or rather, that's where you need to EQ it. That's where to get the best results out of LCD-X, and it's one of the best headphones to EQ. It takes EQ like almost nothing else. It is so great at doing so, and you can fill that gap in. You can make it a lot closer to this sort of target, because after that, it's nigh on perfect. And the treble region of the E3 is very, very similar. So if you have been used to LCDX, if you have used it in the past, the treble presentation is very similar. I'd say there's a little bit more detail and it's a little bit tighter in the treble than the X. But essentially it's that same sort of position. What you're just filling in is all this region here in the upper mid-range. Now, let's look at one of my favourite closebacks, which is actually the sister product to LCDX, and that's LCDXC. Now, on the graph, this looks an awful lot closer, and it sounds it as well. The downside of this, as we've previously said, is the weight. It's over 650 grams. What is it? 677 grams, which is a hefty weight to have on your head for long sessions. However, it's really rather quite close to target. A couple of tweaks here and there, just boosting up mostly that dip that sits around, what's that, about 500 hertz. That's a lovely headphone, albeit that it does start to roll off and become a little bit more uneven at about 50 hertz. And you're then going to want to sort of just boost that area up. But that's very close, you know, the 1 to 2K area, dip that down a touch. But it's actually got fairly good adherence to it. However, detail level wise, the E3 absolutely smashes it. This is still punchy and defined all the way down, even though it's a ported headphone. And that's one of the surprising things. Not a lot of planars are ported, but without having any effect on the punch and the speed of that bass delivery, unlike you would get with a ported speaker. Next slide is the legendary studio model, the Sennheiser HD650, and you can see again fairly close adherence, 100 hertz right up through the frequency range. It does go over between about 3 and 4K, which can get a little bit honky. Knock that down a couple of dB and it makes it a lot better. But what you have got with HD650 is this bass roll off, and unfortunately this is one of the headphones that doesn't take bass boosting very well. So trying to even get that up to a flat line you start introducing distortion. It's just not amazing. But for the rest of the frequency band, it's a very reliable headphone, and why people have used it for decades. Now we get on to the one downside of the headphone, which unfortunately is it needs power. You are going to require something like 500 milliwatts at 32 ohms, which is close enough to the 27 ohm impedance that the headphone actually has. I know that's a really low impedance figure, and you would think that that doesn't need a lot of power, but it's also got fairly low sensitivity at that. So you will need an amplifier that has got more power than most common interfaces. The exceptions being the Apollo X series rack unit, that's about 500 milliwatts at 32 ohms. Or topping the amplifier people. Yes, they make standalone amplifiers, something like the A90D, the L70, even the L50 would drive this really well, but obviously you still need a DAC on it. There's another option, because Topping's new professional range is now out and exclusive to us at Scan in the UK. So here's something. It's a 2-in, 2-out interface, and it's got a 560 milliwatt headphone amp built in. That's exactly what you need for this. I've been driving them out of that for a week, and it is really rather lovely. I'm up at 3, 4 o'clock on the volume dial, but there's still a bit of headroom left for the transients and the peaks. And especially if you mix into some form of processing on your master bus, if you're going into a limiter or anything like that, that'll be perfectly fine. Because what you don't need to do is to leave any headroom for any form of DSP. So there's no boosting on EQs or anything else that you need to do with these. That's perfectly fine. Ignore that. You can use a slightly lesser powered headphone amp to be able to get away with it. Obviously, other choices, RME's ADI range, that's all completely, amazingly good. But again, it has an EQ in it, which you probably won't need with this. And you can also now get some really good mobile choices. So because this will pack down, taking this on the road is an absolute option. So you could try the i-Fi Griffon, but that's, admittedly, that puts out almost a watt out of the balanced output. You could also try their new Go Bar. Now, that's a tiny little DAC, 475 milliwatts out of the balanced 4.4 millimeter output. And let me just take a minute to explain balanced here, because it's not quite the same as you might know in the pro world. Balanced in the pro world does indeed do the same thing. So it splits the signal going out down, let's say, an XLR cable between 2 pins, and one is inverted. At the other end, one's flipped again. Any noise it's picked up is cancelled out. Now into headphones, it does a similar thing in that you get a mirror image coming out, and essentially it's giving voltage to either side of the diaphragm. So when one side pushes, the other side will pull, which is basically doubling the output power of the amplifier. This is the secret to running power-hungry headphones on a mobile device. You need a balanced cable. Most of these have a 4.4 millimeter Pentacon jack, and that's now the future of mobile balance connectors. So you want to look out. The E3, you can get a version with the 4.4 mil jack, and I'd advise you that that should be the one that you get, because it's really easy then to convert that into a 6.35 mil 1/4 inch jack. All you need is a really small adapter cable like this, and that's about £20 from us. And that's it. You've got the balanced version. If you need to plug it into something with a 1/4 inch output, you've got the adapter there to do it, and it's cost you real pennies to be able to do it. You cannot do this the other way round. You cannot convert an unbalanced signal into a balanced connection. So make sure you buy the balanced version of this and then get the adapter to go with it. It works really well, and it'll just keep you on a level. One of the other options you've got is this. This is the Qudelix T71. This has got a 4.4 millimeter output here, and again, lots of power. That output's it's 8 volts at that. It's way over 600 milliwatts into 32 ohms. Lovely. It's also got a full EQ on it. It's got one of the best EQs you're going to find on any device anywhere, even though in this instance you're not going to need it. However, also got crossfeed. Like the RME ADI-2, crossfeed is built in, and just a little touch of it to this will give you that bang-on translation. It really doesn't need much, but a little bit of crossfeed will just replicate the angle of a set of speakers. And of course, you can turn it off if you're, balancing between that and it wanting it to sound right for the most people who now listen on headphones. I think more people now listen to music on headphones than they do on speakers. But obviously, if you're making club music, if you're making stuff that needs to translate to speakers, like most of the world does, then you are going to want to make sure that you've at least referenced what it's like with the crossfeed on. Really handy thing to have, and you have got that on the Qudelix T71. I suppose we look at alternatives at this point, and there's not many. There really aren't many in the close-back design. Dan Clark's own Aeon 2 Noir, but the bass is a little bit over. It brings up the kick as well. What we don't see with this bass boost is it boosting the kick frequency. The boom on the bottom, yes, you're going to get a bit of a boost on, but the thud of a kick is normally 110-ish hertz. It's not even up a dB by that point. Alternative wise then, really hard. The only other option there actually is, albeit that you don't get anything like the soundstage and the imaging here, is Audacy and Maxwell, the gaming headset, because that is the Audacy preset off Maxwell. Now, this is a all-in-one headset. It's got the DAC built in. You can connect up via USB or off a Wi-Fi dongle at low latency. It's a really good headphone, 320 to 350 pounds. Obviously, it's not quite as smooth through the lower mid, but the adherence is there. Yes, it dies off a little bit in the sort of the treble region around 7K, but this is a well-balanced headphone, again, with that sort of slight bass boost to the subs that you expect in the E3s. If you haven't got the money, and these sadly are just north of £2,000, Maxwell is a really good, well-balanced option for mobile production. Hi, it's Future Tom here. We're a couple of days after shooting the rest of the video, and after the edit, it was quite obvious that I needed to explain something a little bit more, in that the E3 is not just competing with close-back studio headphones, it's competing with the best of the open backs as well. And what I want to show you today is 3 of the main contenders that you might be considering and how they stack up. Firstly, Sennheiser HD800S. Now, this is a bit of a bargain at the minute because it's currently around just over half the price of the E3. It also needs a very powerful amp, but its soundstage, its stereo presentation is super wide. It's just chasmous. It's beautiful if you're listening to old material. It's very detailed. It's a very good headphone, but you are going to need crossfeed to go and give you that presentation like it's speakers in front of you. You've really got to toe it in. So it's almost like it's going to waste in some respects. If we look at the frequency response, it's definitely above 6K. You've got to bring that down. 1 to 4K is a little bit under. That needs to come up. And then we've got that bass roll off. When you really get down into the subs, it's dipping down. It's the opposite to the E3, which of course shelves up and brings those notes up. Exactly what we're going to see with other open backs, because especially with planars, I did mention this earlier, it's very hard to get a boost into a planar headphone. However, let's have a look. Audacy's flagship, LCD5. Tonally, bottom end, it does dip down a couple of dB from about 50 hertz, but when we get into the mids, it's a little bit over at 3K. It's got kind of a weird 1K, 1.5K bump. However, the main drawback of LCD5 for me, certainly for mixing, is that dependent on the position on your head, if you've got it slightly forward, slightly back, the tonality changes a lot. So you don't quite know where you are. It's not helped by the angled pads. So you're you're just not staying quite in the same region. And the two lines you can see on the screen are LCD5 in two different positions on your ear. So you can see it really does vary dependent on where it is. It seems a little bit shouty. If you're used to the treble presentation of the other LCD series like LCDX, LCD3 and so what, it's very different. Now, let's look at MM500. Now, I've got to say, this is a much better headphone for mix work than LCD5 because all of that movement change has really disappeared. You put this on and you are getting the same tone. The pads are really uniform around them, and it's a lovely headphone. It's well designed, but sound signature wise very different to the other LCDs. So whereas there's a dip in the mid-range in LCDX and some of the others, with this you've got a peak, so it's a little bit more like HD 650 in that, and then it's a much warmer curve coming down, so you're under the target from that 4K point down. It's a little bit over at 1K. That can just, it's only a couple of dB, but again, needs an EQ cut there. The bit that I don't get on quite as well with this is the treble, because the treble presentation is very, very different to the other LCD range. You can see on the graph, we've got the start of that 9K dip that we're expecting because of it being a rig artifact and measured on a grass rig. But after that, 10 to 12K, it just disappears. Now you can boost that up. You can bring this up and bring back the treble and the balance. But again, you're using an EQ. You're having to go and do that process. Whereas with the E3, it's all just done for you on the headphone without any other mucking about. Also, we look at the sub-octave down, and yes, there's a little bit of more extension. It's only a couple of dB movement anyway. But again, we're under that flat line. It's certainly not with the prominent subs. I cannot think right now of a better studio headphone than the Dan Clark E3. If you're making your living mixing records, if you're a mix engineer, if you're a mastering engineer, this is the headphone you should have. Low distortion, great transients. The frequency response is as good as it gets. It's just beautiful. It's detailed. It's everything that you want. If you have to work away from the studio and do some critical changes on a laptop or a mobile device when you're away, this is the headphone you want with you. I've gone through amp options. This is, take one of those recommended amps, 500 milliwatts or more. It's just a beautiful headphone. I really think this is the standard that we're going to have to measure every other single studio headphone against from now on, because it's that good. I think the other manufacturers are going to struggle making something as good without having the AMTS tuning ability. That is just an absolute winner from Dan Clark. The other headphones he's done with it have been more targeted to the hi-fi listening market. The presentation of them, I just thought, I didn't feel at home mixing on them. They were just a little bit too wide. It just wasn't like speakers. This feels like speakers on your ears. The frequency response is right. The detail's right. It's a lovely headphone. You just need a decent amp. Any other questions you've got about headphone mixing, if you want me to check out a particular set for the studio, please leave us a comment. We're going to get back to you. If you fancy a special viewer deal for sitting through me ranting about these wonderful ear speakers that I've got on, hit us up. scanproaudio@scan.co.uk with the subject line E3, and we'll send you back some special deals. Otherwise, we'll hopefully see you for a video again soon, and I'm off for a very enjoyable afternoon of listening.